Hello everyone and welcome back to another episode of Do I Have Time for This? The series that looks at old and new video games from indie to AAA and everything in between to help you figure out if you've got the time to play, finish, 100% complete a game, or just leave it in your backlog to forever gather dust. Today we're looking at the smash hit action game Black Myth Wukong. Widely agreed upon to be China's first major AAA game, Wukong is based on the Chinese novel Journey to the West, which sees the Destined One, I think, try and reincarnate? As you may be able to tell, a lot of the subtleties of the story are lost in translation for me. Some context that may help after watching a lore video is that a lot of the cutscenes and conversations in this game actually refer to the events prior to the game carried out by Sun Wukong, commonly referred to as the Monkey King. With the game being directly based on a novel which is very popular in Chinese culture, the sales soared in the charts, with 10 million copies being sold in the first 3 days since release. This record-breaking feat was mainly down to the Chinese audience, who accounted for around 80% of Steam players, but once the positive word of mouth got around that the game did in fact live up to the hype of the trailers, many people applauded this game as a solid first effort in the genre from the developer Game Science. All I can say is, if this is what China have to offer in a AAA space, I'm keen to see what this kind of budget and development work can produce in a different genre that isn't so oversaturated these days. Black Myth Wukong tells many stories of many families. With fast-paced combat and incredible visuals, let's see if we can restore the Monkey King back to his former glory. After an incredible tutorial set piece which almost feels like the game is set in space, Wukong brings us crashing back down to Earth with a perfectly shot intro cutscene. Following this, we were revived as the Destined One, and tasked with collecting the old relics we left behind. I followed all the trailers for this game and was hugely concerned it would be a boss rush of sorts, and to begin with, it definitely feels like it. Rather than describing it as a Souls-like as many do, including its Wikipedia page, I'd say the game feels far more like God of War 2018, even down to the chest opening animations. For the first half of the game, you're traversing open areas, often with branching pathways to optional bosses or enemy encounters for various upgrade materials. You can definitely feel the invisible walls here though, and much the same as God of War, you quickly get the idea of where you can go and where you can't. These open areas I feel really could have used a map though, as you can be met with 3 different paths at a fork in the road and easily spend up to 15 minutes down each path before figuring out which one actually progresses the story. These areas definitely fit the new way people do linear games now, the wide linear format, which is great, but without a map it's easy to get lost.
The routes are treacherous, so use your maps.
I lost my map.
You haven't been issued a map yet.
This problem ramps up even more in the last chapter of the game, where you're given a massive play space and just have to figure out where to go with only a few visual clues to guide you. In terms of the actual combat, it can be pretty Souls-like for the most part. There's no penalty for death, but essentially you are moving through areas, fighting bosses and dodging attacks. Whilst you do start off with a fairly simplistic combo, you do get the opportunity to expand on this with different weapons and stances, which allow you to use your staff in different ways. There's also a massive emphasis on spells that you unlock throughout the game. This starts with a simple immobilize spell, but you quickly expand your repertoire to include turning to stone, summoning clones of yourself, and even transformations. Whilst the mana bar can run out incredibly quickly in a fight depending on what skills you've unlocked, as you progress over time and sink some more points into the skill tree, you'll find more and more ways that make that mana last, and you come to understand when it's best to use your most powerful spells. The transformations work slightly differently to spells, and are one of the most useful aspects of the combat of Wukong. Instead of using mana to transform, you have one on a regular cooldown like the spells, and one that functions around Ki, a bar filled by attacking enemies. The one using Ki is a one-time transformation which allows you to use a specific attack move. The other, on the other hand, transforms the Destined One into a completely different creature, granting an entirely new moveset to play around with. These two types of transformation offer incredible variety and are unlocked in different ways. The longer transformations you typically get from boss fights or quests, whereas the one-time transformations are usually granted via a souped-up version of that enemy out in the world, one wreathed in blue flame. These one-time transformations also provide passive buffs, so whilst the attack it grants might not be the most exciting or damaging, but the stat buff it grants may be worth it instead. Whilst many people and places describe Wukong as being an RPG, there's not a huge emphasis on stats here. Instead, the main focus is your skill tree and your gear. When you level up, you'll be granted a skill point to spend on the absolutely huge skill tree. This covers base stats and your normal attacks, stances with their associated abilities, spells, and transformations. Each of these different trees can have around 30 or so, if not more skill points put into them, but luckily this is one of the best parts of this game. You can respec your character at any shrine at any time in the game for free, which means that if a boss encounter isn't working for you, you can change your entire character setup on the fly. The only downside to this huge skill tree is that it can get very daunting on a first playthrough as to what it is you want to upgrade, and when it comes to certain stat upgrades you need to visit an NPC, a problem which does get solved later on by way of an optional quest, but it just makes it harder to remember to go back and get those upgrades. The other part of creating your own build is the numerous armor sets you can find throughout the game. Some are crafted upon beating bosses, some are rewards for quests, and others can be found throughout the world in chests. These armor sets have an insane amount of detail on them, and whilst the defensive stats are all around about the same sort of level for each armor set, meaning you aren't choosing based on stats alone, the true choice comes with the armor buffs.
No.
These buffs have a huge variety, from boosting spells, buffing dodge iframes, or increasing attack, to very bespoke buffs like increasing attack when poisoned or better stamina regen in water. These armor sets also tend to have two different unique buffs for equipping different amounts of it, so wearing two parts will grant you a lower level buff, but allows you to mix and match with a different armor set with a different buff for equipping two pieces. This encourages a massive amount of variety depending on how you want to play, meaning if you do a lot of dodging or rely on a certain spell, you can easily mix your armor to help with both playstyles. This also applies to a lesser extent to the weapons available to you, but they are more concerned with which stance you use. The only thing I will say regarding this aspect of the game is that the NPC that upgrades your armor is locked behind an optional quest, and after a while the upgrade materials will become hard to find, meaning eventually you will have to choose an armor set to keep for the rest of the game. Right, come on then, boss time. I'm writing this without knowing what footage I'm going to use, but I guarantee there's going to have been some boss footage by now. Usually when making these reviews I tend to stick to early game and avoid bosses, but with Black Myth Wukong the first 3 chapters is almost like a boss rush. This can definitely cause some frustration in the early game, where you're stuck between a few different bosses no matter which way you turn, and after finally beating one you can walk down a corridor and slam straight into another.
What have they done to you? Pray for Mojo.
When it comes down to the actual boss fights themselves, all I can say is, wow. For there to be 107 bosses in this game who, for the most part, are incredibly unique and different, is insane. There are certain bosses that are reused, but you can tell time and effort was put into the movesets from these huge monsters all the way down to the human-sized warriors. This being said, despite the combat being really fun and accessible, the bosses aren't always a fun time. Some of the moves that have elemental effects seem to have double hitboxes, with some hitboxes on other moves being completely broken, especially on the end boss of Chapter 4. The camera also struggles massively to keep up with the more cinematic encounters, with sometimes screen-filling enemies, so you have an intricately designed demon or monster, and all you do is spend 5 minutes hacking at its foot and dodging sound cues. This often feels like a massive waste of the art department's time, but believe me, there are some spectacular fights that don't fit this complaint. The last nitpick I have for the bosses is some of the health bars. Oh my days, the health bars. Some of these encounters you will be genuinely hacking away for a good 5 to 10 minutes at a time. Something you won't realize in a Souls game is that the fights themselves, even the multi-phase ones, are actually quite quick. Here in Wukong, the fights can go on forever, and there's genuinely nothing worse than spending 7 minutes fighting a boss, only for one mistake to get you stun locked into an instant death. Switching gears from the bosses, another great addition from game science, whether you're fighting a boss or just a regular enemy, are the journal entries you get once you beat them. These authentic Chinese drawings of the different animals and people you meet are incredibly detailed and come with extensive lore notes too for those who want a bit of backstory to the boss that ground them into paste for the last hour. On top of these, at the end of every chapter we are treated to two different things, an animation unique to that chapter and a tapestry type mural we can inspect for further story beats. These murals are as detailed as the journal entries and often depict the actions we've taken throughout the chapter. The animations, on the other hand, are something else entirely. Often being an innocent story taking a dark turn, they give us some insight into the events prior to the game, that leads the people we find in the game to where they are now. These animations also switch style every time, from cartoon to stop motion to realistic, as the chapters run through. They are truly incredible and something to be proud of. Speaking of which, game science absolutely nailed the graphics here. Even though there's some clipping with the armor which seems to happen in every game, you can see every strand of hair on the Destined One himself, and particularly bosses with fur look incredible. Some set pieces also get insane particle effects, which at times threatened to set my PC on fire, but besides a few dropped frames, the performance was more or less spot on. Originally when I saw the trailers for this, I was convinced the game would end up being like the day before, where what we got wasn't entirely what the trailer promised, but with the financial support from Tencent, this was everything people were after and more. Meditation spots are also worth a shout here to take in the amazing scenery. They just act as a short cutscene to look at the surrounding area before giving you a skill point, but they're often tucked away in secluded spots of the area and look incredible, especially in the snowy areas. So let's get down to it. How long does this game take? In my first playthrough, grabbing 66 out of the total 81 achievements, and only missing one single boss for the entire game, I spent a whopping 49 hours in Black Myth Wukong. If you only mainline the story, skipping a lot of side content and bosses, you're likely to take around 35 hours, but this is massively skill based for the bosses. If you go through the whole game with a guide, then mop up all the additional extras to get full completion, you're looking at a stout 60 hours or so. Upon completing the game, you do luckily get the option of a New Game Plus, with a further option of when you started, so you aren't forced to jump straight into a new game. This lets you get some things you missed, but there is a lot of permanently missable content that we'll talk about in a moment. With regards to respecting your time, Wukong is a bit of a tough one to gauge. Whilst checkpoints are frequent and the game autosaves often, the downside comes when bosses are involved, as there are so many and their health bars can often be incredibly tanky. When you're looking at a two-phase fight, that's actually a significant portion of time. Luckily, as this isn't a hardcore Souls game, you can simply pause the game to allow for ducking in and out of game sessions. But if you're stuck on a boss, you're typically going to need an hour or so session to really nail down the patterns and progress. Otherwise, it's just wasted time. Overall, I'd say there was a significant amount of value for your money here. If you want to see everything and finish as much as you can, even without a guide, you can easily get a lot of hours for your money. And with the game coming in at the price of an old gen game, who's to argue? Whilst I personally felt the game overstayed its welcome, your mileage may vary depending on your tastes. I recommend Black Myth Wukong, but with a caveat. Wukong is an incredible first game from Game Science. With the top budget graphics, addictive, easy to learn gameplay with a somewhat overwhelming number of skills and armors to build your Destined One with, the first Chinese AAA game really shows the whole industry that strong, story-focused single-player games with solid gameplay mechanics is all you need to make a great game. That being said, the huge caveat here is that you like boss fights and Souls-like combat, as to begin with, this game is incredibly challenging. As you level up and acquire more skills, I found the game to only get easier over time, and with the exception of some secret bosses, it was only ever a few tries to succeed. Another thing to bear in mind when picking up Wukong is the sheer length of the game. For those who only have an hour or so a night, you may find yourself playing this game for weeks if not months over smaller play sessions, and may lose the feeling of progression others with more free time feel. I honestly got a bit tired by the end when met with another 19 bosses for chapter 6. I think there was definitely some fat that could have been trimmed off for want of a better pacing. My last true negative of the game is a big one, but I want to say this would never truly put me off a good game. and that's the amount of obscure and missable quests and bosses. Harkening back to my Blasphemous review, which you can find in this playlist, Wukong has an incredible number of hidden quests, bosses, and locations. In fact, every single chapter has a completely hidden optional area which you need to complete for a true ending. I'll hold my hands up. I reached the end of each chapter, then consulted a boss guide to make sure I hadn't missed anything, and from speaking to a house in the far corner of an empty area, playing a drum rattle in obscure places, talking to a horse throughout the entire game, there's so much stuff here that you can just simply miss. Don't get me started on breaking a random wall with a missable spirit in chapter 2, hinted at by one single line of dialogue on the other side of the map. I also lost my mind at the fact I missed one boss across the entire game, because it turns out some optional bosses despawn when the main area boss is killed, and apparently this can happen to 4 different bosses. Who decided this was good game design? What story reason would there even be for this? This one missed boss led me to not being able to fill out the journal for the achievement, meaning I'd have to do another New Game Plus cycle all the way to chapter 4 to get it. This level of missable bosses and items is just so backwards in 2024. In the end, I'd say this is a fantastic game for those who love the Souls games, or maybe even the God of War or Devil May Cry games, where you need to learn enemy patterns but there's less of a punishment upon death. If you don't have a lot of free time or don't want to dedicate a month of evenings to finish this game up, maybe give it a miss? I really love what Game Science have come up with here, and I'd love to see a new game from them in the genre. Do you think you have time for Black Myth Wukong? On this channel I like to give my thoughts on the game alongside a bit more of a deep dive on the time you have to invest, so you know what you're getting into, because time is precious, right? If you enjoyed the video or found it useful, feel free to like and share. If you subscribe, I'm looking to put out regular content like this alongside some more in-depth video essays and freeform videos, so stick around, and if you have any requests on future videos, just drop them in the comments. And finally, if you want to come chat with me, you can find me over on x.com/gracious_rhino. I'm Gracious Rhino, look after each other, and I'll catch you soon.